The arsenic found in James Maybrick's body was not enough to kill him. The Crown's own toxicologist said so, under oath, in open court. The jury convicted her anyway. This is not a story about a woman who poisoned her husband. It is a story about what Victorian England does to a woman it has decided must be punished, and why those are not the same thing. Her name is Florence Maybrick. She served 15 years. The question of whether she was guilty has never been answered. Not then. Not now. We're going to go back to the beginning, to the original documents, the court transcripts, the medical records that were available to that jury, and the ones that were set aside. No dramatization, no editorializing, just the record, and what it actually reveals. Everything that follows is drawn from court transcripts, the contemporary newspaper records, and the Home Secretary's private correspondence. Where the evidence is ambiguous, I will tell you. Where it is not, I will tell you that too. Our story does not begin with a crime. It begins with a crossing. Florence Elizabeth Chandler was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1862. Mobile was a port city, its economy built on cotton, grown inland and shipped outward to the textile markets of England and the American Northeast. The Civil War had disrupted all of that. The money had become irregular, a thing that required careful navigation. Florence's father was a banker. He died when she was too young to remember him clearly. What she inherited was not wealth. There was not much left of it, but a name, a social position, and a mother who understood precisely what both of those things could still be made to mean. Her mother, Caroline, was formidable in the specific way that social survival demands. She would eventually acquire the title of Baroness von Roques through a later marriage to a German military officer. Before that, she was a woman navigating a world that offered women very few navigable routes, and doing it with considerable skill. Florence was educated in France. She learned to conduct herself at a formal table, to move through rooms where people were watching. She was, by the photographs that survive, strikingly composed, dark-eyed, with the particular stillness that reads, from the outside, as self-possession. In November of 1880, she and her mother boarded the SS Baltic in New York, bound for Liverpool. At dinner, on one of those evenings crossing the Atlantic, Florence was seated beside a man named James Maybrick. He was 41 years old. He had spent most of his adult life in Liverpool, trading cotton. He was attentive. He was experienced in conversation. He was, from across a dinner table on an ocean crossing, a man of substance and assurance. The age gap, 24 years between them, was noted by other passengers as a minor scandal. Within the social arithmetic of the period, it was not an unusual transaction. He had money. She had youth and position. The Baltic had not yet reached Liverpool before James Maybrick had made his intentions clear. Their courtship was swift. Within months of the ship docking, he had proposed. Florence was 18 years old when she accepted. The wedding took place on March 27, 1881, at St. James's Church, to Piccadilly, London. It was lavish. It was attended correctly. From the outside, it was exactly the kind of marriage Victorian society regarded as a successful outcome for a young woman of position but limited means. What Florence did not know, because nobody told her, was that James Maybrick already had a separate domestic life in Liverpool. a woman he had maintained a long-term arrangement with for years, 5 children, a life that existed entirely outside the one Florence was being invited to enter. James continued to support this arrangement financially throughout their marriage. She also did not know about the arsenic. James Maybrick had been taking arsenic since his years working in America. Small doses, taken as a tonic, a stimulant, a treatment for what he described as a persistent nervous complaint. But the habit was not entirely unique to him. In certain communities, particularly in parts of rural Austria, small quantities of arsenic had been used as a folk remedy for decades. James had adopted the practice and continued it in England. His Liverpool physician, Dr. Hopper, was aware. It was part of James's documented medical history. What arsenic does to a body over years of sustained voluntary use is not simple. It accumulates in the organs. It alters mood and temperament. It produces episodes of severe irritability, heightened suspicion, a particular obsessive attention to one's own health. A man who has been taking arsenic voluntarily for over a decade does not present as a stable man. But he does not present in a way that makes the cause immediately legible from the outside. Florence moved into Battle Crease House in the Aigburth district of Liverpool. She managed the household. She entertained. She had 2 children, James Chandler, known as Bobo, born in 1882, and Gladys Evelyn, born in 1886. The record is consistent on this point. Florence was devoted to both of them, but the Victorian world she had entered had its own invisible architecture, and Florence was living inside it without fully understanding its dimensions. The dominant social ideology of the period organized domestic life around what was called the doctrine of separate spheres. Men occupied the public world, commerce, law, politics, the open movement of money and power. Women occupied the private one, the home, the children, the careful maintenance of an environment that replenished the man who operated in the world beyond it. A woman who fulfilled this role correctly was the so-called angel in the house. A woman who deviated from it in any visible way was not simply a person who had made a mistake. She was a category violation, and the Victorian social system treated category violations with considerable severity. By the winter of 1888, James was 49 years old and in declining health. Florence was 26. She had 2 small children, a large household running on inadequate funds, the documented financial record, not a characterization of it, no family within reach, and a marriage that had, at some point between the dinner table on the SS Baltic and the house in Aigburth, become something she had not agreed to. Every marriage has a private geography, rooms that appear on no floor plan, distances that cannot be measured from the outside. By early 1889, the private geography of the Maybrick marriage had become irreconcilable with the public one. James's arsenic use had escalated. He was now supplementing his own self-administered doses with visits to multiple physicians, Dr. Hopper, Dr. Humphreys, and at least one London physician, each of whom was providing prescriptions without full knowledge of what the others were prescribing. A man maintaining multiple medical relationships to sustain a habit he does not fully disclose to any one physician. His temperament had worsened with it. The irritability, the erratic accusations, the financial pressure he applied to Florence. These are not Florence's characterization of the marriage. They are in her letters, which were later entered into evidence. They are also corroborated by the testimony of household staff. At the Grand National Races at Aintree in March of 1889, Florence Maybrick met Alfred Brierly. Brierly was a cotton merchant. He moved in the same social world as James. He was younger, unmarried, and attentive in a way that James had not been for some time. The affair that followed was brief, a matter of days, not months. It was conducted at Flatman's Hotel in London in March of 1889 under assumed names. It was not discreet, not by Victorian standards. Florence returned to Liverpool. James, who had apparently received information about the London trip, confronted her. Their argument, documented in testimony from household staff, was sustained and violent. It ended with James striking Florence. That, too, is in the record. The Maybrick household employed a nursery maid named Alice Yapp, as she had been with the family for some time. She was attentive, perhaps more attentive to the family's correspondence than her position required. By April of 1889, James's health had begun a more serious and visible deterioration. He was taking arsenic in quantities that, in the assessment of Dr. Hopper, were alarming, though Hopper did not yet have full visibility into all the sources from which James was obtaining it. James experienced episodes of numbness in the extremities, severe gastric distress, and periods of what Hopper described in his written account as acute, nervous agitation. Florence managed the sick room. She administered medications. She was in regular contact with both of his physicians. She wrote to Alfred Brierly once during this period, a letter she would later come to deeply regret. Not because of what was in it, because of who intercepted it. On the 27th of April, 1889, James Maybrick became severely ill. The sequence of his symptoms, documented in the medical testimony of both Dr. Hopper and Dr. Humphreys, is consistent with acute gastroenteritis. It is also consistent with arsenic poisoning, and it is also consistent with arsenic withdrawal in a habitual user who has suddenly lost access to his supply. All three of those explanations were medically available to the physicians who attended him. They were not all presented with equal weight to the jury. James Maybrick deteriorated over the course of 2 weeks. He experienced persistent vomiting, extreme thirst, muscular weakness, and periods of confusion that the physicians attributed to the illness itself. Florence was present throughout. She administered medications prescribed by his doctors. She sat with him. She also, on one occasion, removed a bottle of beef extract from the sick room, a bottle that was later found to contain traces of arsenic. Florence said she had removed it because she was concerned about its contents and did not want James to consume it. This was entered into evidence at trial. There was a second explanation advanced by the prosecution. There was no forensic evidence that established which explanation was correct. James Maybrick died on the 11th of May, 1889. He was 50 years old. The post-mortem examination was conducted by Dr. Charles Fuller and Dr. Edward Davies. Their findings were entered into the court record. The amount of arsenic recovered from James Maybrick's organs during post-mortem examination was, in the assessment of the Crown's own toxicologist, Thomas Stevenson, insufficient to constitute a lethal dose. This finding was not disputed at trial. The jury heard it. The trial continued. James Maybrick was not yet dead when the investigation began. On the 8th of May, 3 days before his death, Alice Yapp, the nursery maid, intercepted a letter addressed by Florence to Alfred Brierly. The letter expressed Florence's distress at the situation in the house and asked Brierly to arrange a meeting. It referenced her own assessment of James's condition. It was written in the language of a frightened woman, not a calculated one. But it contained words, my own darling, that placed her in an explicitly adulterous relationship. Yapp did not return the letter to its intended recipient. She handed it directly to Michael Maybrick, James's brother, who had arrived at Battlecrease House to assist in the management of the sick room. Michael Maybrick was a prominent figure, a celebrated baritone in London's music halls, a Freemason of considerable standing, and a man who, from the moment he arrived at Battlecrease House, appears in the record as something other than a grieving sibling. The household was placed under what amounted to informal surveillance. Florence was denied access to James's sick room for a period. She was observed at all times. When the letter was read by Michael Maybrick and its contents understood, the machinery of accusation was set into motion. A search of the house after James's death uncovered several items of interest to investigators. Among them, a packet of flypapers that had been soaking in a basin in Florence's room. The flypapers contained arsenic. Florence's explanation that she used the arsenic solution as a facial cosmetic, a practice documented among women of her era and social class, was consistent with known Victorian beauty practices. It was also, in the context of a household where arsenic was being discussed as a murder weapon, extraordinarily damaging. More significantly, a further search of the house revealed substantial quantities of arsenic throughout, in James's coat pockets, in his hat box, in his desk, and in a sealed parcel in his study. His own arsenic. The arsenic he had been purchasing and accumulating for years. The house, in other words, was full of arsenic. Most of it belonged to James Maybrick. Florence was formally arrested on the 14th of May, 1889. She was 26 years old. Her children were taken from her care. The house was sealed. She would not see her son or daughter again for 15 years. Before we enter the courtroom, there is one more piece of context. It does not resolve what happened at Battlecrease House. It does not change the forensic record, but it changes the portrait of the man the prosecution presented as the victim. In 1889, 5 murders were committed in the Whitechapel district of London. The killer was never identified. He was known by then as Jack the Ripper. In 1992, a diary surfaced in Liverpool, a Victorian-era document, written in the first person, authored by a man who claimed to be Jack the Ripper. The diary named him. It said he was James Maybrick. The diary's authenticity has been debated extensively since its emergence. Forensic analysis has produced contradictory results. It has never been definitively authenticated. It has also never been definitively disproven. What it introduced, whether genuine or not, was a question that the prosecution at Florence's trial never thought to ask. What kind of man was James Maybrick? The prosecution's answer was a devoted husband, a victim of his wife's ambition. The record The medical record, the financial record, the testimony of his own physicians suggests something considerably more complicated. Hold that question as we enter the courtroom. The trial of Florence Maybrick opened on the 31st of July, 1889, at St. George's Hall in Liverpool. She was charged with the willful murder of her husband by administering arsenic. The prosecution was led by John Addison, QC. The defence was conducted by Sir Charles Russell, one of the most distinguished advocates at the Victorian bar. The case attracted attention across England and through the Transatlantic press. In the United States, Florence was an American citizen. That fact had immediate consequences in terms of public interest. It would have no consequences whatsoever within the courtroom. Victorian law offered a wife no right to testify in her own defence. Florence Maybrick sat through 9 days of testimony about her life, her marriage, her correspondence, and her character, and said nothing, because she was not permitted to say anything. The Crown's case rested on 4 pillars. First, the flypapers and the arsenic solution Florence had been preparing. Second, the beef extract bottle, which Florence had removed from the sick room. Third, the letter to Brierly, establishing motive through adultery. And fourth, the arsenic found in James's body at post-mortem. The Crown's own toxicologist, Young Thomas Stevenson, testified as to the amount of arsenic recovered from James Maybrick's organs. He confirmed the finding. The quantity was below what medical literature of the period considered a lethal threshold. The defence made this point explicitly. The prosecution did not dispute it. They argued instead that arsenic was present, that Florence had access to it, and that the combination of means, motive, and opportunity was sufficient for conviction. Sir Charles Russell, for the defence, presented the alternative explanation methodically. James's documented history of voluntary arsenic use, the quantity of arsenic found throughout the house, the majority of which belonged to James, the fact that his symptoms were consistent with multiple causes, and that the Crown had not eliminated those alternatives. He also placed into evidence something that the prosecution found difficult to address directly: the testimony of several Liverpool physicians who confirmed that James Maybrick's own documented arsenic habit was of a scale that would have produced exactly the symptoms observed in the final weeks of his life, independent of any external administration. The defence case was coherent. The alternative explanation was medically credible. The forensic evidence was ambiguous by the Crown's own admission. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen presided over the Florence Maybrick trial. He was 60 years old. He had served the bench for 7 years. He was considered one of the foremost legal scholars of his generation, the author of foundational texts on criminal law that were still in use at the time of Florence's trial. His summing up of the evidence lasted 12 hours. In it, he characterized Florence's adultery repeatedly as evidence of her capacity for murder. These are not the same thing. They are not legally related. A woman may conduct an adulterous correspondence and be entirely innocent of poisoning her husband. A woman may be guilty of both. The jury is required to determine which is true in this particular case, not to infer one from the other. Justice Stephen conflated them repeatedly. over 12 hours, he also described the marriage in terms that went beyond the legal record, characterizing James Maybrick's position with a sympathy for which there was no factual foundation in the testimony, and Florence's character with a contempt that was not grounded in the evidence before him. The jury retired, and they returned their verdict in 38 minutes. Guilty. Within 6 months of the verdict, Justice James Fitzjames Stephen had been committed to a private asylum. He died there in 1894. The deterioration that his colleagues had begun to notice during the Maybrick trial, the confusion, the moral conflation, the fixations, the difficulty maintaining the distinction between what the evidence said and what he believed it ought to mean, had, by that point, progressed beyond concealment. The jury that convicted Florence Maybrick was never informed. The public was not told for years. The woman who received a guilty verdict from a jury deliberating for 38 minutes, presided over by a judge who was subsequently committed to an asylum, was sentenced to death by hanging. And the death sentence produced an immediate and significant public response. In England, questions were raised in Parliament. Petitions are organised by women's rights advocates, among the first coordinated public campaigns on behalf of a convicted woman in Victorian England. Florence's American identity amplified the response internationally. The United States government made formal diplomatic representations. Home Secretary Henry Matthews reviewed the case. His private correspondence, now part of the Home Office archive, reference H0144/1639, contains a document that has rarely been cited in popular accounts of this case. Matthews wrote in private that in his assessment, there existed reasonable doubt as to whether Florence Maybrick had administered arsenic to her husband with murderous intent. He wrote this privately. No, he then commuted the sentence to life imprisonment, but on a legal technicality, not on the grounds of the doubt he had expressed, because acknowledging that doubt publicly would have required acknowledging that the conviction should not have stood. The reasonable doubt was real. The reasonable doubt was acknowledged by the man responsible for her sentence. Florence served 15 years. By the standard of what the jury actually heard in that courtroom, not what we now know from the Home Office archive, not the context of Justice Stephen's subsequent committal, but what was placed before 12 men in Liverpool in August of 1889, I want you to consider whether conviction was the only possible verdict. Hold that question. I am going to give you the rest of the record before I tell you what I think. Florence Maybrick entered Woking Prison in August of 1889. She was moved to Aylesbury in 1893, where she remained until her release in January of 1904. The conditions of Victorian women's imprisonment were not documented with the thoroughness applied to men. What is in the record, through correspondence, official reports, and the later testimony of prison officials, is that Florence spent extended periods in solitary confinement, that her health deteriorated significantly, and that she made repeated formal requests to see her children. All of them were refused. Bobo and Gladys were placed in the care of James's family. They were raised to understand that their mother was a convicted murderer. They did not visit, they did not write. They were, by every practical measure, permanently removed from Florence's life. Outside the prison, and the campaign on Florence's behalf continued, fitfully through changing political climates, for years. Clemency petitions were submitted repeatedly to successive Home Secretaries. Some were signed by members of Parliament. Several were signed by women who would, within 2 decades, become central figures in the suffragette movement. Florence Maybrick's case appeared in suffragette literature as an example of precisely the kind of legal injustice that the movement was organized to address. Her American advocates were more sustained. Her mother, the Baroness von Roques, spent years lobbying both the American and British governments. The American press covered her imprisonment in a way that the British press, after the verdict, largely declined to do. Florence Maybrick was released on the 25th of January 1904. She was 41 years old. She returned to the United States. She wrote a book, Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, My 15 Lost Years, which was published in 1905. It sold reasonably well. She lectured briefly. Then the public attention faded. The last confirmed reports of her in any major publication date from approximately 1910. After that, almost nothing. Before I tell you what I believe the evidence shows, I want you to sit with this. You have heard what the jury heard. You have also heard what the jury was not told. You were not told that the Crown's own toxicologist confirmed the arsenic recovered was below a lethal threshold. The jury was told, but the summing up of a judge subsequently committed to an asylum spent 12 hours moving their attention elsewhere. You were not told that the Home Secretary privately acknowledged reasonable doubt. Neither was the public. You were not told that James Maybrick's own documented arsenic habit, spanning years, confirmed by his physician present in his medical record, was never adequately explored as an alternative explanation for his death. The defense raised it. The summing up minimized it. The question of Florence Maybrick's guilt has occupied legal scholars, historians, and forensic analysts for over a century. I do not think it will be resolved in this room, but I think it can be answered, honestly, and with the evidence. Here is what the evidence establishes. James Maybrick died on the 11th of May, 1889. Arsenic was present in his body at levels the Crown's own toxicologist confirmed were below a lethal threshold. The house he lived in contained substantial quantities of arsenic, the majority of it his own. He had been a habitual arsenic user for over a decade, a fact documented in his medical records and known to his physician. The jury convicted Florence on the basis of arsenic in the house, a letter establishing adultery, and a 12-hour summing up by a judge whose mental competence was, at the time of the trial, already in question. The Home Secretary acknowledged reasonable doubt, privately, and then let the sentence stand. What the Victorian legal system required in 1889 was not proof of guilt beyond reasonable doubt in the way we would recognize that standard today. What it required was a narrative in which a woman who had committed adultery, who was foreign, who had deviated from the doctrine of the angel in the house, could be understood as the kind of woman who would do this. The arsenic was almost incidental. What convicted Florence Maybrick was the fact that she was exactly the category of woman that Victorian England had decided must be dangerous. She was not permitted to speak a single word in her own defense. Not one word. In the entirety of a 9-day trial about her life, her marriage, her choices, and her character, she was required by law to remain silent. That is the record. Florence Maybrick died on the 23rd of October 1941 in Gaylordsville, Connecticut. She was 79 years old. She lived alone in a small cottage with a number of stray cats she had taken in over the years. Her neighbors described her as a private woman, reserved, careful with her words, very kind to animals. A few of them called her a cat lady. Almost none of them knew her name, and none of them knew the other one. She was convicted of murder using arsenic that may not have killed him, found in a house full of poison he put there himself. The Crown's own expert confirmed the dose was sublethal. The Home Secretary said there was reasonable doubt. He said it privately. Florence served 15 years. I've given you everything I found. You decide. Crime Unsealed investigates the cases history tried to bury using court records, inquest testimony, and primary documents. No speculation, no dramatization. The record. Read carefully. If that is the kind of history you are looking for, subscribe. Every case we cover is one the standard accounts have softened or set aside. The next one is already being built. The record deserves to be read.